pathetic. But they can actually measure the width of their arm. And if it's below, you know, so many 10, I wasn't 10 centimeters, yeah, maybe 10 centimeters, you know, at an age of what, they probably won't survive. And unless they get immediate nutrition, which is difficult to give them because the body gets to a certain level where it can't even accommodate the nutrition. So this glutathione is extremely important. And B12 functions to maintain it. And actually, the glutathione, which is a tripeptide, 3 amino acids stuck together, actually coordinates in the, where you know where the cyano group was? You put the glutathione there through the sulfur group. And it has very important functions, one of which is to get rid of toxins, metals, and different types of toxins that the body accumulates. And so, I'll just give you some brief examples. You see, with that GSSH, you've taken away the hydrogen, so it's oxidized, and you can measure the ratio of GSH to GSSG, and the higher the GSH is, the more the more the body's able to take care of the oxidative stress. And B12 maintains that ratio. And in HIV, he says that not only, you see, the B12 deficiency shows up at the early stages of HIV infection, as does the low glutathione, reduced glutathione. Ascorbic acid, vitamin C, also has an important function in which it helps to maintain, to be maintained in a reduced state by glutathione and by vitamin B12. So the all three of which are antioxidants. So is vitamin E, and the first three are soluble antioxidants. Vitamin E is more in the fat soluble. So in different tissues, it functions as an antioxidant. So they help each other. They're passing the hydrogen around to each other to make each of them in the reduced state. And so there's a very interesting equilibrium occurring, but you have to have each of the components in some way to refresh them. So if you're totally deficient, you know, of a vitamin, by definition, a vitamin is an essential nutrient. Without it, you get sick early and you die soon. It's essential. Just like there are also essential trace minerals, such as, you know, iron and copper, and cobalt in the form of B12. So these, you know, this antioxidant, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but the erythrocytes, or the vitamin B12 in the red blood cells, the glutathione usually is shipped around to the different tissues in B12. I mean, in the red blood cells. And ascorbic acid helps maintain the glutathione in the reduced state. So it's important to have your vitamin C, your fresh fruits and what have you. And some of your dark greens as well. And B12 also has a function in this process of maintaining tissue GSH. And so, you know, these nutrients are very important with people suffering from HIV. They can maintain neuropathy, very much the same symptoms as in HIV. And it's a leading cause. Ultimately, it causes the numbness and whatnot, and they can get sores and ulcers in the legs, and it's the leading cause of amputation is diabetes, and that's caused by diabetic neuropathy at its extreme. And I'm sure with the high incidence, many of us know in our family people, and usually, you know, older people in our families or acquaintances that have diabetes. And maybe, you know, shuffle can't feel their feet. You see them walking like this. They can't feel their feet. And that's, you know, probably functional deficiency of vitamin B12. Someone who becomes, which happened in my mother's case, she had cancer, and she was being treated, and one of the drugs was RSC, cyclic nucleotide, and she was doing fine, pretty good for the treatment. After about a year or so, then she started, having balance problems getting up. Her vision was a little blurry. Her skin was lemony. She was an Irish lady, blue eyes and light skinned, and it started turning a little lemony, and she started getting a little nasty, paranoid, which wasn't her usual situation, and weak. So it's about a year or so after her treatment, and I used to take her to my father and I would take her to the hospital, to the doctor's office. And I was in this is before I even knew anything about B12, or did anything many years ago. And I went to the library and I opened up and I looked through about vitamin B12 deficiency. All of these symptoms were vitamin B12 deficiency symptoms. Out of 10 of them, the neurological symptoms, she had 8 of them. I go to the doctor, I say, doctor, look at this, I think she has vitamin B12, and says that some of what causes it are some of the chemotherapeutic agents. And I said, hey, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. He got mad. He said, I examined her blood because there's morphological changes in the blood if you have vitamin B12 deficiency. Red blood cells get big, and the hemoglobin tends to get lower and whatnot. And he looks at it to see if there's any of that. And that's how they monitor for B12. They don't take the levels, which I don't think necessarily are the best measurement anyway. And so he got insulted when I asked him, and I restrained myself. Okay, so he's a doctor, and then I took my mother to a general practice doctor, and I told him what I thought. He looked at her eyes like this, the whites of her underneath there, and she said, she looks anemic. You can't hurt. Why don't you give her some B12? He said, I don't necessarily agree with what you said. I told him the whole thing with the doctor, that it's the chemotherapy units, but so he gives her a shot, and he says, well, you can do this too. I said, I can, yeah. So he gave me a prescription, so I started giving her an injection. And the thing is, you give them an injection for 1 week of 1,000 micrograms, and then you give it 2 or 3 times a week, and then once a week, and then you maintain it for, a couple times a month. Within days, those symptoms disappeared, and she got her strength, and she wasn't nasty anymore, and then she could stand up. She, it was like this. It was how she manifested. When she stand up, she had everything just disappeared with taking the B12. So she, after a year or so of the chemotherapy, she finally reached where she was depleted. And, it was amazing. And yet most doctors don't know that. Who give it? That's what got me mad was, if I'm giving some drug, I got to know all the side effects for my patient's sake. And he fought me on that, and I said, okay, and then when she was in the hospital, so it prolonged her life, I would say several years. And when she had to go into the hospital, and I knew I couldn't, they wouldn't give it to her in the hospital. So I'd go in there, under the sheet, and I'm like giving her a drug, I'm giving her vitamin B12, and, it was a lifesaver. So I eventually got into how can we do it, so I don't have to do it under the covers, just give a couple of drops. So that's how I thought of making the Covamax and trying to deliver it in a simple way that would be improved, orally active. Because anything with all those groups, very hard to get across cell membranes. In order to get B12 into your cells, and you take it in your mouth, you chew your food, it comes down to your stomach, the acid breaks it up, releases it, and then there's an R protein that binds to it, and then it goes down to your small intestines where the enzymes and the alkaline media, B12 releases an intrinsic factor that's synthesized in the stomach, but grabs it in the intestines and then delivers it to the ileum just above the appendix, And then in order to, there's a receptor there, but not only do you need the intrinsic factor bound, a big protein with the B12 in its grasp, but you also need calcium. You know, a little side here probably opens up the gate, like, you know? And then it will turn around and put it into the blood, and then there's 3 transcobalamins, proteins that carry B12. The one that's most important, that at least for delivery, is transcobalamin 2, TC2. It binds now and delivers it to the different cells. That's not over. So what's at the cell? A receptor that recognizes the transcobalamin and the B12 and grabs it. It turns around, gets rid of that, and then brings it into the cell, where then it can be used as will be converted maybe to methyl or hydroxyl B12, or adenylyl B12, or glutathione B12, depending what cell. And then it functions with the enzyme system to transfer the methyl group so that you can have proper synthesis of DNA, or you can convert homocysteine to cysteine. Homocysteine has a negative effect on cardiovascular system. It's an inflammatory amino acid that builds up unless you have adequate amounts of folic acid and vitamin B12, which work together in that process. But so anywhere along the line, if there's a tie-up in this bucket brigade, you don't get adequate amounts of B12, or maybe any of it, delivered to the proper cells. And that's a bummer. So if you take a lot of B12 orally, 1% would get in. That's why they have 100 micrograms. But still, there can be problems. It still has to be transported once you got into the blood by all these proteins. And there's some inherited malfunctions, you know, and mutations that interfere with that vitamin B12 with dire consequences. There are on neuropathic and levels as well, and there is some evidence and people treating with that autism, there may be some function, especially of methyl B12 in the proper functioning of the neurological cells that are damaged or misfunctioning in autism. And you know what's happening with autism. It's skyrocketing. It's like 10 to 15 times more common now than 20 years ago, or 30 years ago when my kids were there. There's an onslaught from all this consumerism, plastics in your cups and things in the air and in the food, and the more junk food we're eating and the whole thing in the atmosphere. So, you know, it's tragic, you know, that's the same thing how diabetes is increasing, double and triple. Every 10 years, every 15 years it doubles. That's unheard of. You can't survive. That can't keep going on. Everybody's dying of a diabetic and all the side effects. So you're coming, your generation, you know, what are you doing to stop that? Come right up here, I'll show you something. But you don't have to take care of yourself. And the quality of food and the quality of activities and everything, you have to think. And, you know, certainly a sacred commitment to take care of our children, starting as infants. And